The streets of Rivergate bustled with the familiar energy of a city in motion. Office workers hurried through crosswalks, coffee in one hand, phones in the other. Street vendors called out their daily specials, and the honk of impatient drivers echoed through the air. But amidst the lively hum of urban life, two officers prowled with an air of quiet authority: Officer Anderson and Officer Morris. Their names carried weight in the precinct, whispered in hushed tones by those who had the misfortune of crossing their path. Their reputation? Targeting individuals who didn't belong. They never said it outright, but the pattern was clear. And today, they had found their next mark. At precisely 8:47 a.m., Nathaniel Carter stepped out of a sleek black sedan parked near City Hall. He was a striking figure, mid-50s, tall, with salt and pepper hair neatly trimmed. His navy blue suit, crisp and well-tailored, exuded confidence. A pocket square, folded with precision, peeked from his jacket, and polished leather. Oxford shined in the morning light. In his right hand, he carried a well-worn leather briefcase, a silent testament to years of dedicated work. Nathaniel moved with purpose, his strides even and assured. But to Anderson and Morris, his composure wasn't a sign of respectability, it was a red flag. "Sir, stop right there." Anderson's voice sliced through the air, laced with the unmistakable weight of presumed authority. His hand hovered near his holstered weapon, a calculated show of control. Nathaniel halted mid-step, a flicker of disbelief flashing across his face. His gaze met Anderson's not with defiance, but with the quiet, unyielding strength of a man who had spent a lifetime in rooms where power was measured by restraint. "Officers, is there a problem?" His voice was steady, devoid of panic. Morris stepped forward, arms crossed. "We've had reports of a vehicle matching yours involved in a recent theft." His tone dripped with feigned concern, the kind meant to justify an unjust stop. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow. "That's a serious accusation. May I see the report?" The tension crackled between them. Anderson's jaw clenched. He hadn't expected pushback. Not from someone like this. "Hands where I can see them. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice." The cold metal cuff snapped around Nathaniel's wrists. Bystanders froze. Phones emerged. The weight of what was happening settled over the street like an approaching storm. Nathaniel exhaled slowly. "You're making a grave mistake." But Anderson and Morris just laughed. They had no idea. The weight of the cuffs around Nathaniel Carter's wrists was familiar not from experience, but from years of presiding over cases where men like him were unjustly restrained. Yet, there was something different about this moment. It wasn't just the cold metal pressing against his skin. It was the way Officers Anderson and Morris carried themselves. Their smug certainty, their absolute confidence that he was just another name to be processed, another statistic in their monthly quota. The morning sun bore down on the unfolding scene as bystanders gathered. Some frozen in shock, others recording with their phones. A woman's voice rang out from the sidewalk, sharp with disbelief. What did he even do? No response from the officers. They weren't concerned with explanations. Nathaniel stood firm, shoulders squared, refusing to let them strip him of his dignity. His calm unnerved them. Anderson tightened his grip on his arm, pushing him forward. "Let's go. You can argue all you want at the station." Nathaniel didn't resist, but he also didn't cower. He walked steadily, his head high, each step deliberate. "I'd like to see that report now, officer," he said, his voice measured. Morris scoffed. "Like I said, your car matches the description of one used in a crime." Nathaniel turned his head slightly. "That's not what I asked. I asked to see the report." Anderson's jaw twitched. "Enough." He tightened his grip, but the moment was slipping from their control. Nathaniel's presence, his unshaken demeanor, his refusal to react in fear was unsettling them. He wasn't pleading, he wasn't begging. He was watching. And they felt it. A young man in the crowd stepped forward. "Hey, I got it on video. This is some straight-up harassment." Anderson whirled around, his face flushing. "Step back, or you'll be joining him." The young man hesitated but didn't lower his phone. The energy in the crowd shifted. What had started as a simple arrest was turning into a spectacle. People were watching. And more importantly, people were recording. Nathaniel turned his gaze back to Morris, who was now shifting on his feet. "You have no report, do you?" Nathaniel asked, his voice steady. Morris stiffened. Anderson shot him a look. Don't engage. We're done here, Anderson muttered. Get in the car. Nathaniel held his gaze for a moment longer before turning toward the waiting squad car. He didn't fight, didn't argue. But he knew what was coming. The officers may have believed this would be just another routine stop, another quick arrest to fill their books. But they had no idea the storm they had just unleashed. As the door slammed shut behind him, Nathaniel caught a glimpse of the crowd. Their eyes burned with indignation, with questions, with doubt. The young man still had his phone up. The woman from before shook her head in disbelief. The world had just started watching. And by the time this was over, they wouldn't look away. The Rivergate Police Department was a fortress of fluorescent lights and institutional gray walls. The air inside carried the stale scent of old coffee and bureaucracy, a place where routine reigned supreme. For Nathaniel Carter, the walk through the precinct's halls was an exercise in restraint. The cold steel cuffs still dug into his wrists, a stark contrast to the judicial robe he was supposed to be wearing the next morning. But for now, he was nothing more than a suspect in the eyes of the men who had brought him in. Officer Anderson and Officer Morris strutted through the station like they owned the place, exchanging nods with fellow officers. They relished the power they held in that moment. To them, Nathaniel was just another name on a form, another statistic to be filed away. Guess he thought that suit would save him, huh? Anderson chuckled as he led Nathaniel toward processing. Morris smirked. Some of these guys really think looking fancy means they belong. Nathaniel said nothing. He had spent years on the bench, hearing cases, watching men like these officers weave stories to justify their actions. He knew their type. As they reached the booking desk, a sergeant in his late 50s glanced up from his paperwork. Sergeant Wilkins was old-school, balding, stocky, with a permanent scowl. He barely looked at Nathaniel before turning to Anderson. What's this one in for? Obstruction of justice. Anderson replied smoothly. Got mouthy when we stopped him. Wilkins let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. They never learn, do they? Nathaniel's jaw tightened, but his face remained unreadable. He knew how this game was played. They led him toward the holding cells. A row of cramped, dimly lit rooms with metal benches bolted to the walls. The heavy clang of the iron-barred door slamming shut echoed through the space, a sound designed to strip a man of his sense of control. Morris leaned against the bars, arms crossed. You must think you're real important, huh? Walking around like you own the place. Anderson laughed. Yeah, maybe he's a CEO or something. Maybe he thought we'd just let him go. Nathaniel didn't respond. His silence was unnerving to them, and that made them angrier. What's wrong? Got nothing to say now? Morris taunted. Still, Nathaniel remained quiet. But outside these walls, the world was very much awake. Unbeknownst to Anderson and Morris, videos of the arrest were already spreading online. The footage showed everything: the baseless accusation, the cuffs snapping shut, Nathaniel's unwavering composure in the face of injustice. News anchors debated it. Community leaders condemned it. Hashtags demanding justice began trending nationwide. Yet inside the precinct, the officers remained oblivious. Nathaniel finally broke his silence, his voice calm, but commanding. I need to contact my office. I have court tomorrow. Wilkins, still sitting at his desk, smirked. Court? You planning to represent yourself? Hope you got a good lawyer. Nathaniel held his gaze, his next words slicing through the room like a razor. No. I am the judge. Silence. Wilkins sat up straighter. Anderson's face paled. Morris blinked, his smirk vanishing. The room shifted. The easy confidence they had carried evaporated in an instant. Wilkins scrambled for his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he pulled up Nathaniel's file. The confirmation hit like a punch to the gut. Nathaniel Carter, Chief Judge of the Rivergate Municipal Court. And just like that, the storm they thought they controlled had turned against them. The silence in the precinct was deafening. The moment Sergeant Wilkins' eyes locked onto the screen, every ounce of smug arrogance drained from his face. The words on the monitor glowed like a curse. Undeniable and damning. Nathaniel Carter, Chief Judge, Rivergate Municipal Court. Wilkins swallowed hard, his fingers hovering uselessly over the keyboard, as if there might be some mistake, some error that would undo what he was seeing. But there was none. Across the room, Officers Anderson and Morris stood frozen. their usual bravado replaced with uneasy disbelief. Their minds scrambled for an explanation. Some way to justify what they had just done. Nathaniel Carter wasn't just some guy in a suit. He was the man who held court over cases like theirs. He was the man who had the power to decide their fate. The weight of their mistakes settled over them like a crushing blow. Nathaniel watched the realization unfold with measured patience. He had seen this moment before. Countless times from the other side of the bench, the precise second when a man realized he had pushed too far, that the consequences he never considered were suddenly unavoidable. Anderson was the first to break. "You should have said something." His voice was stiff, forced, as if grasping for a way out. Nathaniel tilted his head slightly, studying him. "Should I have? Would that have changed anything? Or would you have laughed just the same?" Morris took a step back, his eyes darting to Wilkins, as if hoping the sergeant would intervene and somehow fix the disaster unfolding before them. But Wilkins was still staring at the screen, pale and rigid, calculating just how bad this was going to get. And then the phone started ringing. First one, then another, and another. Wilkins snapped out of his trance and grabbed the nearest receiver. "Yeah. What? No, that can't be right. What do you mean it's everywhere?" The answer made his blood turn to ice. "The arrest is viral. It's all over the news." Across the precinct, officers were checking their phones. Some whispered, some cursed, some stole nervous glances toward the holding cells. The world outside was no longer quiet. Nathaniel sat on the metal bench in his cell, watching the storm unfold beyond the bars. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. This wasn't over. Not yet. A minute later, Captain Reed, the commanding officer of the precinct, stormed into the room, her face a mask of pure fury. "Tell me this is some kind of joke." Her voice cut through the tension like a blade, her sharp gaze snapping to Anderson and Morris. Neither officer spoke. What could they say? Captain Reed turned to Wilkins. "Get those cuffs off him. Now." Wilkins hesitated, but one look at the captain's face and he rushed to comply. The cuffs came off, the metal clinking loudly against the bench. Nathaniel slowly rubbed his wrists, his expression unreadable. Reed took a steadying breath. "Judge Carter." "Aye." Nathaniel raised a hand, silencing her before she could finish. He didn't need an apology. He needed accountability. He rose to his feet with the same calm dignity he had carried throughout the ordeal. "I trust I'll be free to leave now, Captain." Reed nodded stiffly. "Of course." Nathaniel took his briefcase from the booking desk, adjusting his jacket as if the morning's events were nothing more than an inconvenience. But as he turned to leave, he let his gaze rest on Anderson and Morris one final time. "I'll be seeing you both very soon." And with that, he walked out of the precinct, leaving behind a room full of men who had just realized their careers were hanging by a thread. The Rivergate Municipal Courthouse had never seen such a crowd. By 9:00 a.m., the courtroom was packed to capacity. Journalists, legal experts, community leaders, and everyday citizens who had watched the injustice unfold online. Cameras flashed, news anchors whispered into microphones, and the hum of anticipation buzzed like electricity in the air. At precisely 9:15 a.m., the double doors swung open, and the room fell into silence. Nathaniel Carter entered, but this time, he wasn't the man in handcuffs. He was the presiding judge, his black judicial robe flowing with authority, his expression calm yet unyielding. Gone was the restrained man from the day before. The man standing at the elevated mahogany bench was the one who held the gavel, the one who would decide the fate of the men who had wronged him. He took his seat, scanning the room, before his eyes finally settled on the two officers standing at the defense table. Anderson and Morris. They were no longer the cocky enforcers of the law. Their shoulders were stiff, their faces pale, their hands gripping the table as if holding on for dear life. The weight of the moment had finally caught up to them. Nathaniel let the silence linger, stretching it just enough for the reality to sink in. Then, in a voice that carried across every corner of the courtroom, he spoke. "Officers Anderson and Morris, you stand before this court accused of racial profiling, unlawful detainment, and abuse of power. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Morris shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, we were simply following protocol. The vehicle matched a suspect's description." Nathaniel raised a hand, silencing him. "Let's test that claim, shall we?" With a nod, The courtroom screens flickered to life, displaying the viral footage of his arrest. The entire courtroom watched the baseless accusations, the aggressive handling, the mockery. They watched Anderson smirk. They watched Morris tighten the cuffs. They watched Nathaniel remain composed in the face of blatant injustice. And now, they watched as Anderson and Morris squirmed, forced to relive their own actions. Nathaniel turned back to them. "That looks like following protocol to you?" Anderson opened his mouth, then closed it. He had nothing. The courtroom murmured, waves of whispers crashing against the walls. The prosecution stood, presenting more damning evidence. Bodycam footage that mysteriously malfunctioned during the arrest. Statements from bystanders who confirmed there was never a report of a stolen vehicle matching Nathaniel's. Internal complaints filed, but buried against both officers for similar misconduct. Nathaniel leaned forward, his voice steady but sharp. "The law is not a weapon for you to wield against those you deem unworthy. It is not a shield for you to hide behind when you are caught. It is a sacred responsibility, one you abused." A beat of silence. Then he delivered the final blow. "Yesterday, you saw me as just another black man who didn't belong. Today, you see me as your judge. But I was both the entire time, and that should terrify you." The tension cracked like a thunderclap. Anderson and Morris sat motionless, their fates no longer in their hands. Nathaniel lifted his gavel, the wooden handle firm in his grasp. "This court finds both officers in violation of ethical conduct. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay, pending a full investigation into your records. Further disciplinary action will be decided upon completion of that investigation." Court is adjourned, a decisive strike of the gavel. And just like that, justice was set into motion. The gavel's echo had barely faded before the courtroom erupted into a frenzy. The murmurs of legal analysts, the hurried scribbling of reporters, the whispers of community leaders all blended into a chaotic symphony of justice in motion. But at the defense table, officers Anderson and Morris sat frozen, as if the weight of their downfall had physically pinned them to their seats. For the first time in their careers, they weren't in control. A court bailiff approached, gesturing for them to stand. The two officers hesitated before rising, their stiff postures betraying the storm raging within them. They had walked into this courthouse believing their badges would protect them, that their usual excuses would be enough. They had been wrong. Across the room, Nathaniel Carter remained seated, his gaze locked onto the two men before him. His face was unreadable, not gloating, not triumphant, just resolute. This wasn't about personal vengeance. This was about justice. The prosecution team moved swiftly, submitting formal charges for an internal police investigation. The courtroom screens flickered again, displaying new evidence, prior complaints against Anderson and Morris, all buried within the department. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the list scrolled. Excessive force allegations, dismissed. Unlawful detainment reports, ignored. A pattern of racial profiling, overlooked. This wasn't just about one bad arrest. This was a pattern. The chief of police, seated at the back of the room, shifted uncomfortably. He had worked hard to keep these cases quiet to protect the department's image. But today, there was no saving face. Anderson clenched his jaw. "This is a setup," he muttered under his breath. Nathaniel finally spoke. "A setup? You mean like the one you attempted with me?" The words landed like a punch, sharp and undeniable. Anderson looked away, his confidence cracking. Morris, his hands balled into fists at his sides, took a deep breath. "So what now? They just throw us under the bus? Like we're criminals?" Nathaniel's gaze didn't waver. "You broke the law. You abused your power. You violated the trust placed in you. And yes, when that happens, there are consequences. That's how justice works." For the first time, Morris had no retort. The court doors swung open, revealing two internal affairs officers. Their presence sent a ripple of dread through Anderson and Morris. These weren't just routine disciplinary officers. They were here to make arrests. The officers stiffened as they were approached. One of the IA agents, a seasoned investigator with a firm expression, nodded toward them. "Officers Anderson and Morris, per departmental review, you are being placed on immediate suspension pending a full misconduct investigation." Morris inhaled sharply. "Suspension? That's your weapons, your badges. Now." A single command. A death sentence for men who had built their entire lives around the shield they now had to surrender. The courtroom held its breath as Anderson and Morris hesitated. For years, they had been the ones demanding obedience, forcing submission, issuing orders. Now, the roles had reversed. Morris exhaled through his nose, slowly reaching for his badge, fingers lingering over the metal as if reluctant to let go. With a sharp breath, he unpinned it and laid it on the table, the small clink of metal hitting wood echoing louder than the gavel before it. Anderson, always the one who carried himself with arrogance, took longer. His hands shook slightly as he reached for his badge. When he finally placed it down, it felt heavier than it had ever been. Their guns followed, collected in silent ceremony, the final act in their fall from power. Nathaniel watched, not with malice, but with purpose. This moment wasn't just about them. It was about every person they had wronged, every life they had upended. Justice wasn't just being served, it was being felt. The bailiff stepped forward, leading the disgraced officers away. The door swung shut behind them, a symbolic closing of a chapter written in arrogance and injustice. But for Nathaniel Carter, for the community, for those who had watched men like Anderson and Morris abuse their power for too long, a new chapter was just beginning. The courtroom had never been so still. Even with the press whispering into microphones, even with the audience holding their collective breath, the air felt thick, heavy as if the very walls understood the gravity of this moment. At the defense table, the seats where officers Anderson and Morris once sat were now empty. They had been let out in disgrace, their badges surrendered, their power stripped from them in front of the same public they had once controlled. But the fallout was just beginning. Nathaniel Carter, seated at the bench, let the silence settle. He had seen justice take its course before, but this was different. This time, the weight of what had just happened stretched beyond these four walls. He lifted his gaze to Chief of Police Raymond Holt, who sat in the back row. Holt's face was unreadable, but Nathaniel could see the strain in his shoulders, the way his fingers tapped against his knee. He knew what was coming. "Chief Holt, would you approach the bench?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Holt stood, adjusting his uniform before making his way forward. He stopped just before the raised bench, looking up at Nathaniel. "Your Honor." His voice was controlled, but there was an edge of weariness beneath it. Nathaniel steepled his fingers. "Your department has allowed officers Anderson and Morris to operate unchecked for years. Complaints were filed, investigations were requested, and yet nothing was ever done. Can you explain why?" Holt exhaled through his nose, shifting slightly. "We handled disciplinary matters internally." Nathaniel leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. "You buried the complaints. That's not discipline. That's complicity." The room buzzed with tension.